There are certain places that just feel wrong the moment you walk into them. You can't explain it. The lights are on. People are talking. Everything looks completely normal, but something underneath all of that is pulling at you, telling you to leave, telling you that whatever is in this place, it was here before the building was, and it will still be here long after everyone inside forgets it ever happened. Schools feel that way more than most places. Thousands of children passing through the same hallways year after year, carrying their fears and their nightmares right through the front doors with their backpacks and their lunch boxes. Maybe that kind of concentrated emotion leaves something behind. Maybe it soaks into the walls. Or maybe some locations carry something that has nothing to do with the children at all. Tonight we have 3 stories, 3 schools, 3 sets of events that were documented, investigated, and in some cases, quietly buried by the people responsible for explaining them. Each one happened during the back-to-school season, that strange stretch of late August and September when summer ends and something else begins. By the time we get to the 3rd story, you may find yourself reconsidering what you think you know about the places you sat in as a child, reading from textbooks under fluorescent lights while the world outside went dark. Let's start in Ohio. In the fall of 1984, a small farming community in western Ohio called Delphos needed a new elementary school. The old building on Crane Street had flooded twice in 3 years, and the school board purchased a parcel of land on the eastern edge of town, cleared it, and broke ground on what would become Hargrove Elementary School. The building was finished in 14 months. It was 2 stories, brick, with a gymnasium that doubled as a cafeteria and a partially finished basement level that was originally intended for storage and a small music room. The school opened in September of 1985, with 312 students enrolled in kindergarten through 6th grade. The first reports came within weeks. Margaret Tolley was a night custodian at Hargrove from 1985 through 1989. She was 63 years old when she agreed to speak with a local paranormal research group in 2003. And she described her first few months at the school in specific detail. She said that the basement level felt different from the rest of the building. Not colder, exactly. She used the word heavy. She said it felt heavy, like the air down there had more weight than normal air, and that when she cleaned the music room in the evenings, she would hear what she described as classroom noise coming from the other side of the concrete wall. Voices, the scrape of chairs, occasionally something that sounded like a child crying, faint enough that she could never be fully certain she was hearing it at all. Margaret said she reported this twice to the head of building maintenance, a man named Gerald Frisch, and that both times he told her old buildings make noise and to stop letting herself get spooked. She stopped reporting it, but she also stopped going into the basement alone after dark. For the first 2 years, the incident stayed small. Teachers mentioned lights flickering in the East Corridor classrooms. A 3rd grade teacher named Robert Haas filed a written complaint in October of 1986, stating that he had arrived at school at 6:45 in the morning to find all of the chairs in his classroom arranged in a circle facing inward, when he was certain he had stacked them on the desks before leaving the previous evening. The complaint is still in the school district records. The explanation written in the margin next to it, and it's in the handwriting of the principal at the time, reads, "Student prank, unverified." Robert Haas told his daughter years later that there had been no student prank. The building was locked. He was the first person inside that morning. Then came October of 1987. A substitute teacher named Patricia Engel was asked to cover a 6th grade class on a Friday afternoon when the regular teacher called in sick. Patricia had subbed at Hargrove twice before and had no unusual experiences on either occasion. She was 26 years old, had recently finished her education degree, and by all accounts was a practical, level-headed person who did not believe in ghosts. School let out at 3:15. Patricia stayed late to grade a spelling quiz and leave notes for the returning teacher. She was in the East Wing classroom, 2nd floor, alone in the building as far as she knew, because the custodial crew didn't arrive until 5. At some point, after 4 o'clock, Patricia heard footsteps in the hallway outside the classroom. Slow, deliberate footsteps. She assumed it was Gerald Frisch or one of the other maintenance staff arriving early, and she didn't look up from her grading. The footsteps stopped outside her door. She waited for a knock. No knock came. Patricia told the Delphos Gazette in 1988 that she sat there for what felt like 2 minutes, looking at the door, waiting for whoever was standing outside it to either knock or walk away. Neither happened. The footsteps didn't resume. She could see the shadow of 2 feet in the gap beneath the door, and those feet were not moving. She stood up. She walked to the door and opened it. The hallway was empty, both directions. She walked to the end of the east corridor and looked around the corner. Nobody was there. She checked the stairwell. She went back to the classroom and stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the place where the shadow of the feet had been. And then she gathered her things, put the graded quizzes in the teacher's inbox in the front office, and left the building. She called the school on Monday morning to say she would not be available for substitute work at Hargrove in the future. Now, a single frightened substitute teacher is easy to dismiss. People spook themselves in empty buildings all the time. The mind fills in what the eyes can't confirm. But what happened in the basement 3 weeks later is harder to explain away. On the evening of November 9th, 1987, Gerald Frisch and 2 custodians named Dale Purcell and Kevin Adair were performing routine maintenance on the basement-level storage area. They were replacing a section of water-damaged ceiling tile near the far end of the corridor, about 30 feet from the music room door. At approximately 7:15 in the evening, all 3 men left the basement. Gerald Frisch wrote in his maintenance log that they had encountered what he described as a situation requiring the area to be secured until further assessment. That was the entirety of his written account. What Gerald Frisch told his brother, who told a local historian who spent years documenting unusual events in Allen and Van Wert counties, was considerably more specific. All 3 men had heard the classroom sounds Margaret Tolley described. Voices, the low background noise of a room full of children. Coming from behind the concrete wall at the end of the corridor, in the space that on the building's blueprints was designated as a crawlspace foundation support, too small for any person to stand in. Gerald Frisch knocked on the wall. The sound stopped immediately. Gerald Frisch said the silence that came after was worse than the sounds. He said it felt like whatever was on the other side of that wall had become aware of them, and that all three men, without speaking, walked back down the corridor and up the stairs and out of the building. He said Kevin Adair, who was 24 years old and had played high school football and was not easily rattled, refused to go back into the basement for the remainder of his time at the school. The basement music room was converted to additional storage the following spring. The far section of the basement corridor was sealed off with a new drywall partition in June of 1988. It was never used again. Patricia Engel's experience and Gerald Frisch's account circulated quietly in Delphos for years. In 2001, a local researcher named Carol Winstead began looking into the history of the land before the school was built, and what she found added a layer to the story that the school board had apparently known about since before construction began. The parcel on the eastern edge of town had been used in the mid-1800s as an informal burial ground for families who had lost children to a series of scarlet fever outbreaks between 1861 and 1873. The burials were not officially recorded because the families were poor and the deaths were frequent, and the nearest formal cemetery was several miles away. The land changed hands multiple times over the following century, and by the time the school board purchased it in 1984, the graves were not listed in any county record. Carol Winstead found references to the burial ground in 3 separate personal diaries from the 1870s, held in the County Historical Archive. One of them included a rough sketch of the land's boundaries. The far end of the basement corridor sat almost exactly over the area the sketch identified as the center of the burial ground. Hargrove Elementary is still operating today. The basement partition is still in place. When Carol Winstead contacted the school district in 2001 to share her findings, the district's attorney sent a letter back thanking her for her research and noting that it would be kept on file. No excavation was ever performed. No acknowledgement was made to parents or staff. The school added a new wing in 2004 on the western side of the building, far away from the east corridor. Gerald Frisch retired in 1999. In his last interview, conducted by a regional history enthusiast in 2009, the 2 years before Gerald died of a heart attack at age 78, he was asked whether he believed the school was haunted. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said that he didn't know what haunted meant exactly. But he said that some land remembers what it held, and that putting a building on top of that land doesn't change what the land remembers. He said he thought about those sounds behind the wall almost every day for the rest of his career. If you're finding this interesting, and hit subscribe. I cover horror and paranormal content every week. Now let's talk about what happened in a college dormitory called Alderman Hall, because this one involves something that moved through a building quietly enough that multiple people encountered it before anyone realized they were all encountering the same thing. Westbrook University is a mid-sized private school in the northeastern United States. The institution's name and location have been changed at the request of individuals connected to the events, several of whom are still living and still employed in education. What follows is based on documented accounts, photographs, and a partially sealed campus security report that was obtained through a records request in 2019. Alderman Hall is a women's dormitory on the north end of the Westbrook campus, built in 1962. 6 stories of standard institutional architecture, wide hallways, communal bathrooms on each floor, the kind of building that has housed thousands of students over the decades without any particular incident. In the fall semester of 2009, 3 students on the second floor reported similar experiences within a 2-week period. The first was a junior named Cassie Morton, who lived in room 217. Cassie woke up at approximately 3 in the morning on a Tuesday in mid-September to find someone standing at the foot of her bed. She described the figure as tall, was her roommate, who sometimes got up in the night to study at her desk. But when she looked toward the desk, she could see her roommate asleep in bed. The figure was still standing there. Cassie reached for her phone to use the flashlight. By the time the screen lit up, the figure was gone. Her roommate, who had not woken up during this, had no explanation. Neither did campus security, whom Cassie called the following morning. The security officer who took her report noted it as a possible dream state confusion, which is a technical phrase that means we're not taking this very seriously. 8 days later, a sophomore named Diana Reeves in room 209, 2 doors down from Cassie, reported waking to find her desk chair had moved from its position at her desk to the center of the room, facing her bed. Diana said she woke up because of a sound, a soft rhythmic creaking, like wood settling, and when she opened her eyes, the chair was directly in front of her, close enough that she could have reached out and touched it. She said there was no one in the chair, but she said it looked in the way that nothing looks like anything, and somehow, anyway, occupied. Diana did not call campus security. She turned on every light in her room, sat on her bed with her back to the wall, and waited until morning. She told her resident advisor, a senior named Jess Calloway, about it the next day. Jess Calloway had been resident advisor on the second floor of Alderman Hall since the beginning of that semester. She was a practical, organized person. She listened to Diana's account, asked some clarifying questions, and told her she'd look into it. That same evening, a third student, a freshman in room 214 named Brianna Okiki, I knocked on Jess Calloway's door and told her she'd been hearing someone moving around in the hallway outside her room late at night, and that twice in the past week she had opened her door to find no one there, but had noticed that the hallway smelled wrong. She struggled to describe the smell. She said it was like something old, like a building that had been closed for a long time and then opened again. Jess Calloway told the campus security office that she believed the second floor had a maintenance issue or possibly a problem with unauthorized entry, and asked them to investigate. Security conducted a sweep of the floor, found nothing, and recommended she remind students to keep their doors locked. What Jess Calloway had not told security at that point, because she was still trying to understand it herself, was that she had found something in her own journal. Jess kept a handwritten journal. He had kept one since she was 14 years old and was consistent about it. She wrote in it every night before bed, always in the same black pen, always in the same narrow cursive handwriting she'd developed over years. Sometime during the first 2 weeks of September 2009, she had written a passage she did not remember writing. The passage was in her handwriting. Same pen, same cursive, same pressure on the page. But she had no memory of writing it, and the content was not the kind of thing she wrote. Her journal entries were personal, reflective, diary-style accounts of her day. This passage was different. It was written as a description of someone watching the second-floor hallway from a fixed point, describing the doors, describing the light, using specific language about being present and patient and waiting. It was written in first person, but it was not about anything Jess Calloway had ever experienced or thought about. She found it while looking back through recent entries to check the date of something she'd noted earlier in the month. She sat in her room for a long time, reading it before she could put the journal down. She later told a researcher documenting the case that the thing that frightened her most was not the content of the passage, though the content was deeply unsettling. It was that the handwriting was exactly hers. The slant, the spacing, the way she looped her letters. It was not an imitation. It was her, and she had no idea when she had written it. Campus security escalated the case after Jess showed them the journal, though the official report, the one that was later partially sealed, characterizes the journal entry as a possible episode of automatic writing during stress, a phrase which sounds clinical and explains nothing. What the report does confirm is that an investigation of room 214, Brianna Okiki's room, they had been patched and refinished in a 1990s renovation, leaving a cavity approximately 18 inches deep, running the length of the room. The gap was accessible through a seam in the back of the closet where the renovation work had not been properly sealed. Inside the gap, investigators found a small folding stool, a battery-powered lantern that was still functional, and a composition notebook. The notebook's contents were not included in the campus security report. The section of the report covering the notebook's contents is among the portions that were sealed. What was released states only that the notebook contained personal writings and that its origin could not be determined. The student floor was quietly reshuffled. Brianna Okiki was moved to a room on the 4th floor. Cassie Morton requested and received a room transfer to a different dormitory entirely. Diana Reeves left Westbrook at the end of the fall semester and did not return. Jess Calloway finished her senior year. She did not speak publicly about the events for almost a decade. In 2018, she gave a detailed account to an independent researcher who had been building a file on the case, and she said that in her years since leaving Westbrook, she had occasionally opened her journal and found passages she didn't remember writing. Not often, not regularly, but occasionally. She said she had learned to read them carefully and then close the journal and not think about them. She said they always described watching. She said they always described being patient. There are things that find you. Most of the time, you never know. But sometimes the door isn't fully closed, and in that gap between the ordinary world and whatever is on the other side, something learns your handwriting. Now we come to the third story. And this one is different from the first two, because the first two involve buildings, enclosed spaces, the weight of walls and what they hold. This one happened outside, in an open landscape, in the middle of the day, with 44 people present. And there is still no explanation for what those people lost. In September of 2003, a high school environmental science class from Millbrook Regional High School in a rural area of the Pacific Northwest took a scheduled field trip to a nature preserve about 20 miles from campus. The preserve covered several thousand acres of old-growth forest, meadow, and rocky terrain around a river valley. The field trip was a standard annual excursion. 42 students, their teacher, a geology specialist named Dr. Franklin Webb, who had led the trip for 6 years, and a parent volunteer named Sandra Chu. The group arrived at the preserve's main trailhead at 9 in the morning. They were scheduled to hike to a geological feature called the Basin Shelf, a section of exposed ancient rock formation that Dr. Webb used each year as a teaching site, photograph and record specimens, eat lunch in the meadow at the base of the shelf, and return to the trailhead by 2:30 for the bus back to school. The hike to the Basin Shelf took approximately 90 minutes. The group arrived at 11:15. What the trip log, the school's official documentation, and the timestamps on the digital photographs taken by Dr. Webb all confirm is that the group was at the Basin Shelf at 11:15 in the morning. The next confirmed timestamp on any photograph is 12:47. That is an hour and 32 minutes with no photographs, no trip log entries, and according to every student and adult present, no memory of what occurred. Dr. Webb told school administrators that he remembered arriving at the Basin Shelf, gathering the students, beginning his initial remarks about the geological formation, and then standing at the lunch site in the meadow with everyone eating sandwiches. He had no recollection of the transition between those two moments. He said it felt, as best he could describe it, like he had blinked, and the blink had taken 90 minutes. Sandra Chu, the parent volunteer, reported the same experience. She said she remembered the hike up clearly, remembered reaching the shelf, and then she was sitting on a rock eating her lunch, and the sun had moved considerably from where she expected it to be. The 42 students were interviewed separately by school counselors in the weeks following the trip. None of them reported any distress or trauma. None of them described anything that had happened during the missing period. They simply did not have the missing period. It was not a blank space in their memory. It was as if it had never existed. The afternoon picked up exactly where the morning had ended, without any sense of interruption. All of this would be strange enough on its own. A group experiencing collective time loss in an outdoor setting, with no chemical explanation found, no medical events, no gas or atmospheric conditions that could account for it. The school brought in several specialists. None of them produced a satisfying explanation. But there are two additional elements to this story that have kept researchers interested for 2 decades. The first involves 4 students who, when interviewed separately, gave identical descriptions of something they each claimed not to have seen. The interviews were conducted one at a time over the course of a week by the school's head counselor and a child psychologist brought in from the district office. The students had not been asked about anything unusual. They had been asked open-ended questions about the field trip about how they were feeling, about whether anything had seemed different to them. 4 students in 4 separate conversations used almost exactly the same phrase to answer the question of whether they had noticed anything unusual. They each said some version of, "There was something tall in the trees at the edge of the shelf, but I didn't really see it." The phrasing varied slightly. One student said there was something standing very still near the tree line, and I didn't look at it directly. Another said, "I noticed something tall at the edge of the clearing, but I don't know what it was because I wasn't looking at it." A third said, "I think there was something in the trees watching us, but I'm not sure because I didn't see it." All 4 students appeared calm while describing this. None of them seemed frightened. When pressed for more detail, all 4 gave similar responses to the effect that they couldn't describe it more fully because they hadn't actually looked at it. They had only noticed it in the way you notice something at the edge of your vision without turning toward it. The counselor's notes on these 4 interviews are careful and measured. They note the similarities in language. They note that the students were interviewed separately with no opportunity to coordinate their accounts. They note that none of the students appeared to be fabricating or performing distress. And they note that when each of the 4 students was asked why they hadn't looked directly at whatever they'd noticed, all 4 gave the same answer. They said it felt like looking at it directly would have been the wrong thing to do. The second element involves a disposable camera. Millbrook Regional High had a practice of providing disposable cameras to student groups on field trips, the kind of cheap point-and-shoot film cameras that were common in the early 2000s before everyone had phones with cameras built in. Several cameras were handed out at the beginning of the Basin Shelf trip. Most were returned on the day of the trip or the following week and developed by the school. One camera was not returned until 3 weeks after the trip. It was turned into the school's main office by a student who said she had found it in her backpack while cleaning out her room at home and had forgotten it was there. She said she had no memory of taking it on the trip, though her name was written on the back in her own handwriting, as the school required. The camera was developed. Most of the photographs were normal. The hike up to the shelf, group shots, close-ups of rock formations, students eating lunch. One photograph was different. The photograph showed the basin shelf from a distance, as if taken from somewhere in the tree line. Looking down at the shelf from above and behind it, the shelf itself is visible, and the meadow below it, and in the meadow, the students are visible, small but identifiable as a group, sitting and eating. The photograph's angle is not one that any student or adult on the trip reported being at. To take that photograph, you would have needed to be in the trees above the shelf, approximately 40 feet above the meadow level, in a section of the preserve that was off the designated trail. Dr. Franklin Webb was shown the photograph along with all the other developed images. He identified the location in the photograph as the basin shelf and the students as his class. He confirmed that no one from the group had been in that position during the trip. He was then asked whether the photograph could have been taken by someone else who happened to be in the preserve that day, and he said it was possible. He was asked whether he believed that was what had happened. He was quiet for a long time. He said he didn't know what he believed. He said he had led that trip 6 times, and nothing like this had ever happened before or after. He said he still thought about the 92 minutes regularly, and that the not knowing was, for him, the hardest part. He was asked, finally, whether he wanted to speculate about what had happened to the group during the time they couldn't account for. He said no. He said he had learned to be careful about looking at things directly. The researcher who documented this case noted that Dr. Webb's phrasing in that final answer matched almost precisely what the 4 students had said about the figure in the trees. The Basin Shelf field trip was discontinued after 2003. The school cited budget constraints and curriculum changes. Dr. Franklin Webb retired in 2011. He has not spoken publicly about the trip since 2007. The disposable camera photograph is in the possession of the researcher who documented the case. He has described it in detail in written accounts, but has declined to publish it, stating that some things are better left to the imagination of the people hearing about them rather than confirmed for everyone at once. He says that what the photograph shows in the trees, to describe what they see in the upper left corner of the frame, go quiet for a moment before they answer. And then they say something tall. 3 schools, 3 sets of events that were documented, investigated, and quietly folded into the ordinary history of ordinary places. A burial ground under a basement corridor, a narrow cavity in a dormitory wall, a meadow under an open sky where 44 people lost 92 minutes and something stood in the trees and waited. There's a version of each of these stories where everything has a rational explanation. Old buildings make noise. Stressed students have vivid experiences. Group psychology can produce shared confusion. Photographs get taken by strangers. Maybe that's the right version. But Gerald Frisch spent 14 years listening to the sounds behind that wall. And at the end of his life, he said some land remembers what it held. And Jess Calloway still occasionally opens her journal and finds passages she didn't write, describing watching, describing patience, describing the hallway outside her door. And 4 students on a school field trip, interviewed separately, each said they noticed something tall, and that looking at it directly felt wrong, and not one of them could explain how they knew that. The school year is starting. The hallways are filling up again. The buses are running their routes. The classrooms are being unlocked for the first time since summer. Whatever was in those places over the break is still there. It was just waiting for everyone to come back. If you want more stories like these, click the video on screen now and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.